If you're worried about nuclear annihilation or the world's superpowers blowing us up, or fearful that we're headed towards killing the planet by global warming or overpopulation or any of the other fears that people are attempting to put into our minds on television, I'm here to tell you that the book of Daniel and Revelation, but we're studying Daniel now, will help us find peace and understand that none of that is how the world will end. We would be best to simply smile when we hear these stories on the news from various news reporters who have no biblical knowledge. The book of Daniel is the twin book of Revelation, and it tells us exactly how the world is going to end. And it gives us signs along the way so that we will understand exactly where we are in time. As we study for the next 32 weeks, we're going to find security and hope. And we're going to learn that God is in total control of everything that happens in this world. God is in control of every single ruler, of every single nation, including the United States of America. Not one thing is going to happen that isn't in His will. As a matter of fact, God is in control of our lives if we submit them to Him. When we do, we can be absolutely sure that nothing happens to us that He has not permitted, and it will work out for our salvation. As we study these 32 weeks, we're going to discover the amazing story of the cosmic, intergalactic drama unfolding between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and the ultimate triumph of Jesus Christ over Satan and evil. Daniel is my favorite book of the Bible to study. I hope that you, if you're watching, will tune in, or if you're listening on the radio, every Saturday morning at 10 a.m., from 10 a.m. to 10:55, and join us for this study. We live stream every week on Facebook. We live stream on our church website, which is charlotteadventistchurch.com. Click on the live button at the top. You're also invited to join us here in the sanctuary, 920 North Sharon Amity, Charlotte, North Carolina. Come as you are, walk in. The greeters will show you into the sanctuary where we have the Daniel seminar. Again, our website address is charlotteadventistchurch.com. You also can download free from any app store WGFY Radio app, and all of our seminars are posted on that app. The book of Daniel is one of the most fascinating in the Bible. It is the companion to Revelation. But both books are written in symbolic language, and they must be interpreted by the Bible itself. Private, man-made interpretations have no validity whatsoever. Those two books give us a clear understanding of Jesus Christ, of the war in heaven, and the introduction of sin to the universe. If you talk to most people, they will tell you heaven is a place where there's no sin, has never been any sin. It's all loving and peace, and God reigns there. And you look at them and say, that's where sin began. We will find that sin that began in heaven, in a perfect environment, will come to an end. and Jesus Christ will return to take his faithful people home. Why would God provide so much symbolism in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation? God obviously wanted his people to be informed, but he wanted to be able to reveal the information at different times in history. And if everything were very plainly written, it would have long been destroyed by wicked men who didn't like what the prophecies say. Even now, there's been a new translation of the Bible with how many? 200? 20,000 changes. You see, in order for men not to do that before it was time to reveal what God wanted to reveal, he made the books in symbolic language. And by using the symbols, God could reveal world events in history at exactly the time his people needed to know that information. For example, 600 years before Jesus' birth, the year of the Messiah's anointing was revealed to Daniel. You see, this meant that there could be no mistaking it when it happened. The Redeemer of the world that God promised to his people happened right on time. The end of probation for the Jewish nation as God's special chosen people was also predicted by Daniel. All of this we're going to learn as we study. And this is absolutely against the popular thinking of today. Today that has a rapture theory, that has the church raptured off the earth, that has Jesus returning and reigning 1,000 years in Jerusalem, and all the world turning to God. None of that is true. It's not biblical. And this is the reason that God so carefully preserved the information and had it come to us at a time when we needed to learn it. Many liberal theologians deny the authenticity of the book of Daniel. Criticism of Daniel first appeared in the writings of Porphyry. He lived from 232 to 305 AD. He was a vicious persecutor of Christians. He was a follower of Plato and Aristotle. He was a vegetarian, not for his health. He was a vegetarian because he believed strongly in reincarnation, and he didn't want to accidentally eat one of his ancestors. His famous book was entitled Against the Christians. He was the first to put forth the idea that Daniel was written in the Maccabean period of 168 to 164 BC. You know, that's the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There were 400 years there without a prophet, without any writings. And primarily his book Against the Christians consisted of fantasy stories. Once you begin studying, you would quickly see that his writings are nonsense, and yet to this day, people hang on to his theory that Daniel wasn't written by a genuine prophet called Daniel. Time is divided into before Christ and after Christ. Time counts down to the birth of Christ and forward after his birth. Today, secular authors have changed that. It's before the Christian era and after the Christian era, instead of simply before Christ and after Christ. So let's take a look at where Daniel fits into history. If we look at the timeline that I have on the screen, beginning with Adam and Eve, about 1,500 years after Adam and Eve, the flood occurred. Isn't it interesting that it didn't take them long to become so wicked that God had to wipe out everybody in the world? And then we come to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and King Saul and King David and King Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam, and then to Daniel, about 586 or so before Christ. When the Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem and carried the people away as slaves, Daniel and his friends were in that first group of Jewish captives. There was to be a 70-year captivity of the Jews for disobedience to God. Many give up on understanding the prophecies in Daniel and Revelation because all that symbolism just confuses them. They look at the beast and the horns and the images. I want you to know that if you stick with us every week, you will have all the symbols explained so clearly to you that you can in turn explain them to others. We're going to begin our study today with the author and the date of the book of Daniel. Now, we know that Daniel is the author because the angel giving him the vision says so in Daniel 12, verse 4. It says this, "But thou," about you, Daniel, "shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." Daniel 12:4. Let me ask you, are we seeing many run to and fro in the world today? When Daniel said this, I don't think he had any idea that there would come a day when individuals actually could get into a plane and fly around the world. It was so far beyond Daniel's imagination. Knowledge shall be increased. Who would have thought, even when I was a kid, who would have thought that there's so much knowledge, but that we could tap into it by tapping a button on a computer? It's unbelievable. And think about our children and our grandchildren growing up in this world where they don't even know what a typewriter is, much less a ham radio, much less the cars you cranked to get started. They're growing up in a scientifically unbelievable world. And Bob was mentioning last night at our communion service, they're building the largest telescope ever to be built in the whole world, anticipating what they're going to be able to see in the largest telescope ever built. And I don't know when they're going to finish it. I don't think they know either. But it is in process. Knowledge shall be increased. What do you think Daniel would have done if he could have seen Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 lift off in 1977? And they're now clear out beyond our solar system into intergalactic space. And they're still sending back pictures to NASA. Who would have thought? If Daniel had written that 500 years before Christ, we would have dismissed him as just saying a fairy tale. And yet, look at the age in which we're living. Daniel 12:9 and Daniel 12:9. Daniel is told that the words are sealed up until the time of the end. The fact that we can now understand the book of Daniel, completely understand it, should tell us that we're living in the time of the end that was predicted by Daniel. How can we be certain that the book of Daniel, the prophecies we're going to study, and they're really something to study. Some of them you'll see as we study, are very pointed. Matthew 24:15 tells me how I can know for a fact that the book is authentic. Jesus himself told his disciples in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, he was referring to 70 AD, when the Romans were going to come against Jerusalem and ravage completely the city, burn the temple, carry all the items in the temple away to Rome. Jesus recognized that Daniel was a prophet, that what he said was true, that his prophecies were true. He warned what was coming. And if Daniel were not truly a prophet, Jesus would never have mentioned that. But if Jesus says he's a prophet, I'm pretty certain I can believe in his writings. Furthermore, only someone who was intimately acquainted with King Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon could have written the details of history that are revealed in the book of Daniel. We even know when the book of Daniel was written. Daniel 1 verse 1 tells us it was written in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. This would have been about 550 to 600 years before Jesus Christ was born. Since the book was written by the prophet Daniel, it would have had to have been written while the prophet lived in the 6th century BC. In the 6th century, about 606 BC, Daniel was taken captive to live in Babylon, and he lived to become an old man. He lived through the Babylonian reign into the Medo-Persian reign, which began in 538 BC. The setting for the book of Daniel was a time of great strife for Judah, for God's people. But they brought it on themselves. Because of their disobedience to God, the nations of Israel, 10 northern nations, had been taken captive by the Assyrians. Eventually, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar for the same reason. And most of the Jews were carried away captive to Babylon. Over 10,000 the first time, then they came back and carried off another 15 or 20,000. So the book of Daniel begins with Jerusalem being wasted, desolate, by the heathen king Nebuchadnezzar. Temple burned, God's people being removed to a strange land. Our study will reveal that God brings good out of every bad situation in which his people find themselves. Daniel 1:1 says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Nebuchadnezzar would have been young. I really researched this a couple of years ago. When he led the first campaign against Jerusalem, he couldn't have been more than his early 20s based on when he died. He got news that his father died, and he hightailed it straight across the desert, about 900 miles, to claim being king after his father died. And then he returned to finish the capture of Jerusalem. So if Daniel was taken captive, we believe somewhere around 13 or 14 years old, and King Nebuchadnezzar now was in his early 20s. There's not that much difference in their ages, which may account for how close they came and how much Nebuchadnezzar listened to Daniel throughout his lifetime. Note that for the king of Babylon to seize Jerusalem, and I just told you this, he would have crossed, see the red line on the screen? He would have crossed the desert, or he would have gone up around the Euphrates River, down through the mountains. Also, 126 years before, God had let Assyria destroy the northern kingdoms because they wouldn't obey God. Wouldn't you think Judah would say, God has wiped out the northern kingdom, they're gone, they're carried on, they're called the 10 lost tribes to this day. Wouldn't you think they would say, my, God can destroy us too, unless we're obedient? But it doesn't seem like they ever thought like that. After years of probation, the northern kingdom, the 10 northern kingdoms, did not have one single king in their history that was true to God. Not one. Judah received 126-year probation because they occasionally had some good kings interwoven with the bad. The focal point of the book of Daniel, Daniel 12, verses 4, verse 9, verse 13, even though the book of Daniel was written while God's people were captive in Babylon, because of their sins, the focal point of the book is not the Jewish captivity. The focal point of the book of Daniel is the time of the end of the world. That's why it's so important to us. As we study Daniel, we need to keep in mind that everything in the book is pointing to the end of the world. This is what gives the book such meaning for God's children today. There are two basic parts to the book of Daniel. The first half is historical. It contains stories about Daniel's life in Babylon and some things that happened to him as one of the king's servants. But the stories aren't there just, for our entertainment. What the book says about history provides a key that unlocks history's meaning. It opens a window through which we can see how the God of heaven is guiding the affairs of the world towards the great climactic event, the second coming of Jesus. The second half of the book is prophetic and carries the prophecies that point directly to the end of the world. And the book of Daniel is like pulling a curtain back on history and showing the world that God is guiding the affairs of all nations. He guides the affairs of all rulers, and all is moving towards his second coming. Many people, in their haste to quickly unravel the prophecies of Daniel, have skipped the historical section. And if you do that, you miss a lot of the meaning of the book. The stories of Daniel are not given simply as stories. They illustrate what the prophecies predict. The stories reveal what happened to Daniel and his friends in ancient Babylon are symbolic of the experiences you and I, the people of God, will have at the end of this world's history. Always remember that the focal point of the book of Daniel is the time of the end of the conflict between good and evil. And we're going to study both the historical part and the prophetic part. In addition, we'll study the great key prophecies of both the book of Daniel and Revelation. Is it really important that we study prophecy? You know, a third of the Bible is prophecy. God must have meant that we understand it. 2 Peter 1:19 says, "We also have the prophetic message as something reliable, and you would do well to pay attention to it, as a light shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts." It's kind of sad that instead of studying the biblical prophecies, people are turning to the occult and spirit mediums and even witches in an endeavor to understand the chaos of the world. The Bible says prophecy is like a light. Revelation, Daniel, provides Christ-centered light in our lives. The books we've said are written in symbolic languages. In order to interpret the prophecies, we need to understand the biblical meaning of the symbols. When we understand the symbols, the prophecies make sense. We're going to start with just 3 symbols. First, a beast. Daniel 7:23, Daniel was told the beast is the 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. So in prophecy, a beast represents a nation, a power, or a kingdom. Ezekiel 4:6 says, let's understand day, a prophetic day in prophecy. Ezekiel 4:6 says, "I have laid on you a day for a year." So in prophecy, a prophetic day equals a literal year. So the 2300-day prophecy in Daniel actually is 2,300 years of time. Now, this is not true unless it's prophecy. Jesus died on the 3rd day. That doesn't mean it was 3 years. It means a literal day. The 3rd symbol I want you to consider is water. In prophecy, Revelation 17:15 tells us that for the waters that you saw are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Well, this doesn't mean every time water appears in the Bible, it means people. It means when water appears in a prophetic message, then it means people. Let's look at how to interpret Daniel. 4 major prophecies in the book of Daniel. Daniel 2, 7, 8, 9. 8 and 9 are together, and 10 through 12. Each of these prophecies cover a broad sweep of history, from Daniel's day to the end of time. Daniel 2 gives us a broad outline of human history. We call it the Parade of Nations, from Daniel's day till Jesus comes. Daniel 7 covers that same period, but uses different symbols and elaborates on, gives us more details of certain parts of the prophecy. Daniel 8 and 9 cover the same ground, but add further details on the time of the end. Daniel 10 through 12 again covers the same information, but with more details, further our understanding of the end of time. The principle that Daniel used is called outline prophecy, in which world history is outlined from Daniel's day to the end of time. And each prophecy elaborates, gives us more information on the time of the end. In employing this method, Daniel made certain that he rooted the prophecies in history. So as they unfold, we constantly can see where we are in the stream of time. In other words, we'll discover that each of these major prophecies begins in Daniel's day, continues down through history, then focuses on end time. And we will discover that we are living right at the very end of time. In fact, there is nothing else to happen before Jesus comes. Let's spend a couple of minutes talking about why God let the Babylonians come against his people, ravage Jerusalem, burn down the temple, carry all those chalices and articles back to Babylon. Why would God let this happen? When the Israelites entered the promised land, God commanded them to observe every seventh year as a year of rest for the land. Leviticus 25, 2-7. Every seventh year was to be a Sabbath for the land. They could sow their fields, plant their vineyards, gather their produce, but every seventh year they weren't to plant or eat anything off the land. Nobody was to work the land, not their servants, not strangers. And the cattle weren't to work either. Everything that grew on the land in the seventh year was specifically for the poor people of the land. Leviticus 25, 18-24. Wherefore, you shall do my statutes and keep my judgments and do them, and you shall dwell in the land in safety. And the land shall yield her fruit, and you shall eat your fill and dwell therein in safety. And if you say, what shall we eat the seventh year? Behold, we shall not sow nor gather in our increase. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the sixth year. And it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. And you will sow the 8th year, shall sow the 8th year and eat yet of the old fruit until the 9th year, until her fruits come in, and ye shall eat out of the old store. In other words, trust me, I'm going to pour it on you the 6th year. The 7th year, you do nothing. It lays fallow. But I'm going to pour it out on you so that you'll have enough for 3 years. Okay, the Israelites didn't trust God. They were accustomed to planting and growing and harvesting themselves. And this was, in God's eyes, a serious violation of what he had commanded. For every 7th year, they failed to give the land a rest and do what God said. So Leviticus 26, 28-35 says, God will chastise you 7 times for your sins. I will scatter you among the heathen, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it lieth desolate, and be your enemy's land. So the Babylonians, flattening Jerusalem, carrying them away as slaves, was their own fault. They failed to observe the land's 1 year in 7 rest period. They failed to observe it for 490 years. So the term of captivity was pronounced as 70 years to make up the deficit. Between entering the promised land and the Babylonian captivity, the land Sabbath, every 7 years, was ignored 70 times by the Israelites. So they were sentenced to 70 years of captivity to give the land rest and for God to restore the city. You know, this should cause us to look very carefully at what God commands. The Israelites couldn't see how they could survive if they skipped a whole year of planting and harvesting, meaning they simply didn't trust God. Every time I read this story, I ask myself, how much do I really trust God? It is a serious thing not to trust God. He takes it as a personal affront. He is our shield. He's our help in trouble, and we ignore him at our own peril. At the siege of Jerusalem and the subsequent victory of Babylon, the people just simply did not trust God. Throughout the book of Daniel, we'll see how the force and outcome of obedience and disobedience plays out in God's people's lives. Ask ourselves today, how often do we go along to get along? How long do we keep quiet? How often do we keep quiet rather than speaking up for God when we have a chance? I don't know. We all need to study this book and apply it to our lives. And we will be awed by Daniel and his 3 friends. They believed the word of God. They believed they were doing his will. They went peacefully and submitted to the king of Babylon. We know they were captured as teenagers. They received Babylonian names, and they were made eunuchs and servants to King Nebuchadnezzar. They were educated in the very best schools of the land. They were taught several languages. The Bible tells us they were good-looking and smart, and yet they were true to God's word. I'm awed by them. They simply believed doing his will was the right thing to do. During all these years, Daniel and his 3 friends simply, quietly, and loyally performed their duties as royal officers to the best of their ability. And after their scholarly training, they became members of the elite group that were called wise men who served the king as advisors. It was during this period that Daniel had the unique opportunity of explaining or interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to cover that in a couple of weeks. Daniel was appointed to a position he was exceptionally a high rank, which he seems to have held it for many years. This office gave him the opportunity of acquainting the king with the power of the God of heaven. I know God placed him there for that purpose. He was in a terrifically evil, idolatrous society. We sometimes look around and we see our young people going the way of the world, and we see older people also giving in to society and the culture around us. These stories are for our benefit. They should serve us as a warning as to how God views sin and idolatry. We're living in a society, as they did then, that seems to make it all okay. Everybody worships however they feel like. It's not okay with God. The stories in Daniel are to be repeated before Jesus comes. There will be laws demanding false worship. There will be laws demanding our obedience to the laws that command us how to worship, what day to worship. If we live to the end of the world, we're going to face the same things we're reading about in the book of Daniel. We will be persecuted. Will we trust God? Will we believe that he will save us? And if he doesn't, are we willing to die rather than sin? If we are not willing to die rather than sin, we will not be saved. because that is going to be the issue before Jesus comes. We will put our lives on the line. We know this from prophecy. We know it's coming. Here's the thing, and this bothers me, and I pray about it. If we can't be faithful when there's no persecution, please tell me what we'll do when the persecution actually comes to our front door. Many of us are ready to quit church if somebody simply says something we don't like. What are you going to do when they come to kill you? How in love are we with Jesus Christ? And this is something we need to consider before the persecution begins. These are words from Ellen White. The greatest want of the world is the want of men. I'm sure she means and women. Men who will not be bought or sold. We've heard all our lives, everybody has a price, haven't we? Men who will not be bought or sold for any price. Men who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. We today are fearful of calling sin by its right name because it isn't politically correct. There have been pastors in America just last year arrested for preaching against alternate lifestyles. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. Men who will stand for the right though the heavens fall. Does that describe us? This will be the character of people that are saved. I want to be one of these faithful stewards as Daniel was. I don't know how you feel about it, but I know that as I study and read, and I will share it with you as we go through our lesson study. If you look at what is happening around us, there's no way you cannot understand that we are so close to Jesus coming. Read Sustainable Development. Look it up. Read the United Nations agreement. Read it. Go read it. Read the Pope's Green Sunday. Look it up. Don't be ignorant of what's happening around us. Did you see the new statue that has just been erected in front of the United Nations? How many of you have seen it? Anybody in here? 2 people. They've always had a dove. They took the dove down. In front of the United Nations now looks exactly like the beast that we've been preaching about that comes up out of the sea. It's like, what? Are they mocking God? Why would they have this huge beast looking exactly like the beast we've preached about for over 100 years sitting in front of the United Nations? Look it up. Look up new statue in front of the United Nations building, please. Because I feel that we come to church, we sing our songs, we listen to a nice sermon, we all comment whether or not we like it, whether or not we got anything out of it. We go home, we do our thing, we come back next week and we do it again. All of this stuff is going on around us, and we're ignorant of it. And we're told that it's going to break on the world as an overwhelming surprise. And if you're not watching what's going on, you'll be one that's surprised. And we shouldn't be. Please understand the John 17 movement. Look it up. The John 17 movement says that we all will be one. And there is now a worldwide movement for everybody to be one religion under one God, with the Pope as the head. He has met last year, has a meeting coming up this spring with Islam, with their leaders, with the Imam. They met last year in Ur, the city of Abraham, so that we all can be one. Have we not been saying this is coming for over, 100 and some years? Our Supreme Court is made up of Catholics and 3 Jews. How long do you think it would take for a national Sunday law to pass? It would take 1 meeting, 1 hour, 1 vote. When the national Sunday law passes, probation for Christians is closed. Not for the rest of the world, because then the plagues will begin to fall, and they have the ability then to make a decision for or against Christ. Let me ask you again, are we ready? What are we doing? How much television did we watch last week compared to how much we read our Bibles? What are we doing with our time when time is so short? It's great to help the needy. It's great to do community services. None of that will save us. The only thing that's going to save us is being on our knees, studying our Bible, understanding where we are in time, giving the message that Jesus is coming soon to everybody that will listen. And sometimes we're more concerned with making a person a Seventh-day Adventist than we are with making them a servant of Jesus Christ. First, we must introduce them to Jesus. And in order to introduce them to Jesus, we need to be Christ-like, so that they say, I want to be like that man. I want to be like that woman. What is it that makes her so happy when all this is going on in the world? Why does that man never curse? Why is that man always happy? Why does he always have a cheerful thought for everybody? Why do I see him praying with people at work? I need to find out what he's got that I don't have. This is what we have to be, what Daniel was to be saved. We're going to find that Daniel prayed 3 times a day in front of his window facing Jerusalem. The whole city could see him praying, and he didn't care. How long has it been since you stayed on your knees beyond a few minutes? Talking to myself too. I'm going to tell you again, we're going to learn that Jesus is coming. We're going to study the prophecies, and we're going to realize that there's nothing left. We're now living in the very toes of the image that was the dream of Nebuchadnezzar that we'll study in 2 weeks. Let's be serious Bible students, because time is short. The devil knows it, even if we don't.